Well, hello. Thank you for joining us for our virtual Francis Scott Key Lecture Series, FSK from Home. I am Margot Copera, Public Programs Manager at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. Thank you to everyone who has joined us today and those who have donated to our FSK from Home Giving Challenge so far this year. We actually have raised $500 for this program alone. And that is incredible support from all of you out there. It really makes a difference and has a big impact on all of our work that we do here at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. If you would like to donate during this program, check the chat for the donation link that I will put in there shortly. Again, welcome to our first FSK virtual program, FSK from Home, for our fall season. We are back here at it again. And for this season, we are still pulling back that curtain on our collections. We're going to connect you with the Maryland Center for History and Culture staff and our colleagues as they reveal the stories behind the objects that we preserve, interpret, and display. Today, Mark Letzer, President and CEO of the Maryland Center for History and Culture, will be in conversation with two authors of the newly published exhibition catalog, Joshua Johnson, Portraitist of Early American Baltimore. You can view Joshua Johnson portraits currently on loan from the Maryland Center for History and Culture at the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts in Hagerstown in the exhibition Joshua Johnson, Portraitist of Early American Baltimore through January 23rd. So let's begin this conversation. I'm going to invite Mark to come on with us. Thank you, Mark. And I'm going to leave it to you.
Thank you very much, Margot. And this is a great opportunity. I'm always excited to talk about Joshua Johnson. We're excited also that we loaned all of our collection. In fact, we have the largest collection of Joshua Johnson portraits in the United States, and we loaned them all to the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts. So we're excited. They brought other portraits by Johnson together for that exhibition. So we are delighted to be able to do that. So I'm going to introduce our two panelists today that have joined me for this great conversation. I'll start with David Taft Terry, and David Terry is an associate professor of history at Morgan State University. Professor Terry writes about the American South, African American history, urban history, and the history of social justice struggles in the United States. His most recent book, The Struggle and the Urban South, Confronting Jim Crow in Baltimore Before the Movement, University of Georgia Press, 2019, has been recently reissued in paperback. Prior to joining the Morgan faculty, Terry held posts at the Maryland State Archives and the Reginald F. Lewis Museum of African American History and Culture. A lifelong resident of Prince George's County, in 2021, we are delighted to say that he joined the Board of Trustees for the Maryland Center for History and Culture. Welcome, David. And our next panelist that has also joined us is Daniel Folco, who serves as Agneta M. Stein Schreiber Curator at the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts in Hagerstown, Maryland. Dr. Folco received his PhD in 2014 from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. From 2004 to 2007, he served as Assistant Director and Curator of the New Britain Museum of American Art in New Britain, Connecticut. Dr. Folco is a scholar of European and American art from the 17th to the 19th centuries, and his research also engages with the exhibition of Islamic art at World's Fairs. He is the curator of the exhibition, Joshua Johnson, Portraitist of Early American Baltimore, at the Hagerstown Museum of Fine Arts. So to get it started, I thought I'd just basically give a little bit of an update on Joshua Johnson. So who was he? Joshua Johnson was born in 1763, the son of an enslaved woman belonging to William Wheeler Sr. in Baltimore County and George Johnson. Joshua's father purchased his freedom for 25 pounds from Wheeler and apprenticed him to a blacksmith in Baltimore named William Forepaugh until he reached his majority. Johnson has long been reputed to be one of the first African-American artists in the United States. Until recently, Johnson was believed to be the very first. We will hear today about Johnson as well as other African-American artists and learn about his life as well as those of his sitters. Where did Johnson work? How did he paint and how did he find his sitters? Why is Joshua Johnson important? And what sets Johnson apart from other portrait painters in the early Republic? How did Johnson maneuver in a slave society as a free man of color? We will address these and other questions today and see what we can glean of this mysterious man. So to start us off, why is Joshua Johnson important? And I'll just open that up to Daniel or to David to start the conversation.
Sure. Well, I would say that the reason that I find Johnson important is because of the insight that he gives us into early national American life, particularly the urban South, Baltimore, United States. In fact, at the time, Johnson is coming into his own as a young person and moving from the county into what is then Baltimore town, a small bustling seaport of a few thousand people. We don't have very many opportunities to see Black life, particularly as Black life might reflect the broader community, such as a portraitist like Johnston might. So for me, Johnston and his ability to connect the dots with some other interesting personalities in the development of institutions in the early 19th century in Baltimore that not only speak to what we need to understand sort of in our concern for local history, the rise of the Methodist Church, the early development of free Black schools, the interplay between free and enslaved Black people within that slave society that you mentioned, a portrait painter like Johnston and the requirements of his vocation to move between two, if not three worlds, the free Black world that he inhabited, the enslaved Black world that was all around him, and the world of his wealthy white clientele. It just gives us an opportunity to see so many aspects of early national life from a perspective that we simply are not afforded by other sources.
Maybe this is a good time, Daniel, before you add it to maybe get to the slide of Abner Coker, which is one of the first portraits that we're going to have here for today's talk.
Yes, and one thing to also is very interesting to me and why Johnson's so important and actually quite unique at the time is he does have predecessors, African Americans who are painting in early America, but Johnson leaves behind such a large body of work, which is not the case for his predecessors. So he leaves behind, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Mark, somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 to 200 portraits, I think probably are existing today. It could be more than that, but that is a very large, as we say in art history, oeuvre, because in many other instances, the paintings left behind by the artists, you can count them on your fingers. So that really sets Johnson apart and shows how much patronage he received.
So Daniel, you mentioned also, we've talked, I mean, for years, I mean, especially when you look at that seminal exhibition and research that was done in the 1980s with Carolyn Weekly and Stiles Colwell, where I think the total number of portraits was in the 20s, you know, so the number has grown exponentially, but we also, back in the day, it was believed that he was indeed the first African-American painter in the United States. But you say there's new research. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the other portraits that have surfaced and their authorship?
Yes, and I'd be glad to do that. And I should also add that since we have this slide of Abner Coker up here, the other thing about Joshua Johnson is that we have two portraits depicting African Americans, and in this case, ministers who lived and worked in Baltimore. That is also unusual. His predecessors, we don't have any portraits, that many portraits of African Americans, save one, which we'll talk about today. So, and I believe that Johnson probably created more portraits of African American subjects, but these are the only two remaining. So you can go to the next slide. And to answer your question, Mark, about the new research. Well, for some time, this portrait was known. It's in the collection of the Moreland Spingard Research Center at Howard University. And it's a portrait of Richard Allen by Reverend G.W. Hobbs. And Hobbs, as far as we know, only left behind this very nicely done pastel of the all-important Richard Allen. So this is really very interesting because we have an African-American artist working in Baltimore prior to Joshua Johnson starting, or at least officially, his career, which we believe began in the 1790s, the mid to late 1790s. And this is really a fabulous record because we're able to also compare this image to how Johnson portrayed Abner Coker. They do wear a very similar costume, although their expressions are different and the format is different. This is pastel. It's actually very small. It would be probably about this big. I haven't seen it in person, but it really intrigues me. And it leads me to believe that the Reverend G.W. Hobbs, of course, both a minister and an artist, was the official artist of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, if I'm correct there with that. So that's really very interesting. He was doubling up. He did both professions. And feel free to jump in here, David. I don't know if you know more about this figure, about G.W. Hobbs, probably more certainly Richard Allen.
Yeah, I would just add that your last point, I think, is instructive, not only as we're trying to understand Johnston, but as we're trying to provide the appropriate context for understanding this idea of Johnston's place as an artist. Of the works that have survived, he is certainly, if not the first, among the very first that we know, at least in part, made a living, at creating, at being a portrait painter. The notion of commissions sustaining someone's livelihood it was not that common, at least as far as we can tell, for artists of whatever color. So the fact that Hobbs, as you rightly pointed out, had 2 or 3 sort of streams of income, we'll put it that way, from his talents as an artist, as well as his leadership of his faith community. We should see Johnston in that light and try to understand perhaps what we don't know or have not yet recovered about him with regard to his other skills. We know he was trained as a blacksmith, and we know that some of the surviving oral testimonies refer vaguely, or at least somewhat vaguely, to a blacksmith who was also an artist. And there's certainly a vibrant community, or at least a vibrant tradition of African Americans enslaved and free in blacksmithing. I mean, here in Maryland, from the western parts of the state, there are J.W. Pennington and others who have written about their lives and the role that blacksmithing not only played for them, but also helped them to attain freedom and status in some way. So as we look to establish Johnston and to understand him within that larger community, one of the things we should do is to keep our eyes open for not just Johnston the artist, but Johnston in other walks of life, including alternative professions like blacksmith.
I guess it was very typical in the early republic, both in the colonial period and the federal period, to have multiple sources of income. I know that in my work with silversmiths in the colonial period, they had to do many different things, many different lines of businesses to be able to survive. Yeah. And it was a luxury to be able to rely only on one source of income. So it's very, very interesting on this. So let's talk a little bit about Baltimore. And we have a couple of really wonderful views. We have this one from Baltimore, from Howard Park by George Beck, painted in 1796, right at the time when Johnson is starting to paint. And, it's a beautiful, lush view, probably a little romanticized, little Western view. But then we also have a view of Baltimore from Federal Hill, showing Federal Hill by Francis Guy, painted in 1805. So it's a really interesting period. It's right at the beginning, the first decade, I would say, of Johnson's career, especially with the next image. So Baltimore, and David, this is something that maybe you can really speak to. Baltimore is often hailed as a city with the highest number of free blacks in the United States by 1860. Sure. But how does this landscape compare with that of 1800? because I would say it is an inverse number just 60 years before. So can you elaborate a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I think the spans between those two time frames tells us more perhaps about economic developments and shifts and the demographic impacts that they have, more so than perhaps it might otherwise be interpreted. Baltimore had no particular affinity, if you will, as a government, as a body of leading politicos, had no more particular affinity for people of African descent, slave or free, than any place else really, certainly in the South, but in any of the sort of growing metropolises. The undercurrent themes that I think help us to understand this notion of a shift of Baltimore's Black population from predominantly enslaved to predominantly free from the colonial to the sort of Civil War period, is this idea that this shift doesn't come without tensions and doesn't come without a sense of crisis, if you will. There are a few places in the United States, New Orleans certainly comes to mind, to some degree Savannah comes to mind, where we can draw lines of demarcation, where we can draw efforts and intentions, particularly because of the makeup of what we might call a Black elite, if you will, financial elite, if you will, in those cities, to distance themselves and to maintain that distance between themselves and the enslaved. But most other urban environments, and certainly Baltimore and Richmond and the other older urban environments in the former slaveholding states, that simply was not possible, nor is it in large evidence. We have every reason to suspect that the free status brought its benefits, but that the free African Americans not only never lost sight of the enslaved, but they didn't lose sight because the enslaved were virtually their kin and friendship circles. And then there was also the fact that during Joshua Johnston's lifetime, it was not simply that slavery was disappearing, but the enslaved population was being shifted, quite frankly, shipped south in the way that we colloquially understand it now. So all around him, we can understand and perceive people like Johnston and his wife, Sarah, and later on in his life, although we don't have yet to recover their names, any grandchildren or nieces and nephews that may have come into their family clan, this ever-present threat of being sold south, of being kidnapped. We have so many narrative and oral traditions about the so-called Georgia men who stalked cities like Baltimore, who stalked cities like Richmond, who stalked cities like Washington, D.C., looking to populate the cotton fields of the states just coming into being, the Alabamas, the Mississippis, the Louisianas. So the status is important for us to understand how Johnston moved about and what may have been the opportunities available to him. I would simply caution us to making too much about the difference between the slave and free status in the real world, or even the preponderance of free to slave. Because remember, perhaps our most famous Baltimorean of this time period, Frederick Douglass, the enslaved man, despite the ubiquity of freedom and free Black status all around him, still had to leave Baltimore in order to become who he was. So.
Fascinating. So Daniel, from an art historical perspective, what sets Joshua Johnston's portraits apart from other painters in the early Republic?
Well, for me, what really distinguishes him is the fact that he's not what he had been referred to, at least in my view, and sometimes in the past, and this would be certainly the case in much older literature, that he was an intuitive, or as they like to say, sometimes a folk painter. He is not that. He has much more refinement to the way he handles the figures, and I classify him as an artist working in the early Republican or early federal style of portraiture. However, it is not one that has any kind of very elite or high society pretensions. And by that, I mean that he's not paint in the manner of somebody like Gilbert Stuart or John Singleton Copley, or even to some degree, the Peels, his is much more sober, it's much more straightforward. And that speaks to the fact that his patrons didn't wish to be perceived in an overly elite manner or identity. And that was something that he was really able to capitalize on, and that helped to propel his career. And that you can find that in other forms of portraiture at the time. Artists working in Baltimore and between Baltimore and Washington, like Frederick Kemmelmeyer or Caleb Boyle, also Jacob Freimeyer in Pennsylvania, though his work is a little bit more stiff, and not quite as gentle and as soft, and certainly as detailed as Joshua Johnson's. That's, for me, what really distinguishes him, is that he is coming out of a tradition of late colonial and the newly emerging early federal portraiture and he's very attuned to these developments in painting, and he had access to models and examples, more so than had been previously argued, in my opinion.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, I know that we had mentioned, I think we're having a little bit of technical issues, but we'd mentioned portraits of William Duguid and Barnes and Phyllis Wheatley. And I know we have these images, we're just waiting to see them now. But Margot is going to try to forward them, but she's having a little bit of, so can we talk a little bit about William Duguid and the Phyllis Wheatley painting?
Yes, I thought that what will be interesting and instructive today is to do a little comparing with two artists who worked in colonial Massachusetts, and actually post-revolutionary Massachusetts. Because as I was preparing for today's discussion, I noticed some language that was being used to describe these two artists. And namely, you have a man named Prince Dema Barnes. He's one of the artists. And then you have the very little known but mentioned Scipio Moorhead. And we'll start with Prince Dema Barnes. And Prince Dema is an American painter of African ancestry who was formerly enslaved but active in Boston during the late 18th century. There's a portrait of a textile merchant named William Duguid, who is, it's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. They acquired it in 2010, so not too long ago. And Dema Barnes is a very interesting story. And I think we're going to get to this afterwards when we see the advertisement. This is really intriguing that he's mentioned by his master. His master's is Henry Barnes, and Henry's wife Christian, in a letter as they purchased Dema, and quote unquote, with the intention of improving his genius in painting. And it's very intriguing to hear this, because Joshua Johnson uses the same language about this aspect of referring to himself as a genius. That was also, there was also an artist of African descent referred to in a Boston paper at the time. And that was in the Boston newsletter that was describing, and quote unquote, a Negro of extraordinary genius, Negro artist of extraordinary genius. I find that to be very interesting. And that was in January 1773.
That's interesting. I was about to ask, that was actually one of the issues I wanted to talk about, was claiming to be a genius. I mean, that's pretty out there, right? I mean, you're saying you're self-trained,
Sure.
and you've got the Peels running around, and that's pretty gutsy for Joshua Johnson to basically say, you know what, I'm a self-trained genius. So I know you have that other example.
I would just add this, that within the context of the sort of historical period, I think the use of the term genius is playing off of any other descriptor of race and challenging what the natural, if you were, reaction to the portrait sitting community, the wealthy white portrait sitting communities, sort of predispositions to hearing the phrase Negro or colored or African portraitist. The qualifier of genius on some level is probably a necessary advertising moniker to let them know that whatever you think this, because I'm telling you I'm a genius and I'm self-taught. Probably playing against the penchant for wanting to know under whom someone trained, so you might have some sense of their style or what you might get sort of as an outcome, as a consumer, just in the basic consumer sort of level. So I think it certainly is gutsy, but it certainly is on some level racialized within the context of white supremacy and other modes of thinking that are certainly at play and coloring any challenge that Johnston or other African Americans who are trying to earn commissions, trying to, make a name for themselves, as Johnston clearly was, as not simply someone who painted, but a portrait painter, as someone worthy of commission, someone worthy of fee, someone worthy of trust for his talents. He literally had to put it out there and defend his reputation or build his reputation against some challenges that perhaps non-African American or non-artists of color had to defend themselves.
Maybe we can look at the next slide, which is the one that has Johnson's first advertisement, where he calls himself the self-taught genius. But David, that's really interesting that you say that. I don't know that I'd ever thought of it as being racialized, or that he was actually trying to compensate for what may already have been thought was a preconceived idea that he couldn't possibly be.
Sure. It's a counter narrative. Think of all of what we know about the language outside of art making, the language with which all institutions of white American life justified the fact that even as citizens, even as free citizens like Johnston, they could be treated differently. And it wasn't so much a moral statement. It was rarely a sort of political statement. It was always situated in some sort of justifying text, either biblical directive or intellectual, what we later call eugenic sort of a justification that if they are free, they aren't ready for full freedom. So there's always that underlying counter narrative that is necessary in whatever professional walk of life African-American women and men are pursuing, to sort of stake that claim. Despite what you think, let me correct your thinking. And in Johnston's expression, I'm a genius.
Yes, and David, just to sort of continue with what you were saying there, I also will probably ask a little bit of a question here. In the European tradition, Black artists were seen at courts as a curiosity, as a novelty, going back to the Renaissance, that if they could be able to create a portrait, for example, of an aristocrat, it was an amazing feat. That they would have the creative and or intellectual capacity. And this was another issue I was talking about in the catalog with Joshua Johnson. Do you think that Johnson was kind of, not to use the word fighting, but working with this baggage as well?
I think he understood the context of his times. If we can just take, as I referenced, the varied oral traditions that have emerged, I believe it Johnston came to art historians' sort of purview in the 1940s, I believe. And one of the earliest bodies of evidence that gave Johnston his historical sort of setting, his historical footing, were all of these oral traditions, where not only had the early, late 18th and early 19th century sitters remembered this Black artist, but they had handed that down to their descendants, so much so that in the 20th century, people still remembered that Black artist. So I don't take that as coincidental. And what I wish were possible, and in the essay that I contributed to the catalog, I probably pose more questions that I would love to have the answer to than what I actually say definitively. But Johnston's ability, or his experiences rather, dealing with this wealthy clientele, but also dealing with the service staffs of these wealthy clientele. We can't imagine that someone would have the inclination and the financial wherewithal to commission portrait painters and live otherwise pedestrian lives. They probably had retainers of all sorts, and many of these would have been people of color or whites of lower economic status. What are the conversations that are happening, or what was being said between Johnston and these sort of economic peers, if not racial sort of colleagues, as they're setting up? And he is doing this thing that is obviously unique, doing this thing at a level that he feels comfortable, self-describing himself as a genius. And as we pointed out, the productivity of hundreds of paintings now assigned to him, other people must have agreed, because he kept getting paid to do this over and over. again.
Absolutely. David, that brings me to this question of fluidity, right? I know you say not to make too much out of the free and the enslaved, but I have to question how, I mean, his in and out, everybody he painted basically had slaves. They owned slaves. So what was the relationship, being able to go into these houses or not? And his fellow, African-American, some were in bondage, some were not. That is the part that I'm trying to understand, how you're going in basically into a house where you may not be that free, you may not be that safe.
Sure.
I'm talking about safety. How do you know that one of these people that's commissioned you isn't going to sell you south, like you said, and wound up with one of, so that's one of the things I wonder. All of these people held slaves.
Mm-hmm.
That's fascinating to me as an art historian to try to understand basically how did that work in his mind.
Sure. Well, I'm of at least two minds with that question. The first is, unless we have other evidence about the sitters that, for example, placed them actively within the burgeoning domestic slave trade. During Johnston's life, Johnston passed away, if he passed away when we believe he did, the 1820s. That was at the beginning of the what's now called the domestic slave trade. I mean, many scholars have written that because of the ending of the transatlantic slave trade by constitutional requirement in 1708, I believe it was, coinciding with the emergence of the Cotton Kingdom as we have now known it in Alabama and Tennessee and Georgia, Mississippi, this demand for this labor population, just as the traditional enslaved sources were being cut off. Some scholars place the number at as many as 2 million, what we would otherwise call Black Marylanders, Virginians, Delawareans, being picked up and sold and sold south, as it were. So as this is just ramping up, unless we have some sense of the sitters for whom Johnston worked as being actively involved, I don't know that he would have necessarily been afraid to go into someone's house for example. But he certainly would have been aware of everything that's going on around him. He certainly would have known either neighbors or through other connections in his lives, people who were beginning to disappear, this crisis that was beginning to rise and be a part of African-American consciousness, particularly in the Upper South. In terms of his relationships more broadly with these sitters, these are people who were used to having folks wait on them. I mean, I would leave it to Daniel and you, Mark, as art historians, to talk more about what was the convention of having one's portrait painted. Would you see the artist as an equal? Would there be conversations going on, or would this be a tailor, or would this be someone who's there to decorate your home or otherwise provide a service without necessarily leveling status? So I can't answer it from that point of view. But I know and hypothesize in my essay that certainly the broader Black community was aware that, for want of a better description, one of their own were getting paid by these wealthy folks to create these paintings. And the few paintings of African Americans suggest that to have a Johnston painting, particularly toward the end of his career, was something of a status symbol, and even Blacks who might access that opportunity were beginning to take advantage of it. So,
Daniel, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, I think that the status and the relationship between Johnson and his patrons would have varied. If we go to the example of one of his early patrons, the Moles, Mrs. John Mole, her husband John oversaw Joshua Johnston's manumission. That relationship, and I don't want to speculate too much, might have been somewhat closer. In other words, he may have spent more time in their household. It is possible that John Mole, as an amateur painter, may have provided instruction to Joshua. So in that case, my hypothesis is the relationships would have varied. Some families, perhaps the McCormicks, he would go in and simply he would be providing a service. But in the case of others, he may have had more conversations with them. And one of the other things that comes to mind also is engaging the children so that they sat still, because it would have taken quite some time to get them to cooperate for something like this. So as David was saying, it raises more questions than we have answers to it. But in terms of looking at how portraits were done historically in many different periods, I think Joshua Johnson would be more on the end of providing services, but we don't know if that was exclusively the case, as he was not an assigned painter in the sense of being under one patron support or sponsorship. And
as it was typical in Europe.
That was typical of Europe. And in some cases, some portraitists who spent a great deal of time with the American political elite or other social circles in the United States. Exactly, Mark.
Well, Daniel, it's interesting that we bring up Ellen North Mole, Mrs. John Mole, because she was painted as a 16-year-old by John Wollaston when he came from England. She was painted by John Hesselius in the 1760s, a very renowned portraitist. She was painted by Rembrandt Peale as an older woman, but then she's painted by Johnson. And that is actually one of the exceptions when you consider that Johnson, which kind of leads to one of the final questions I had of Johnson painting the rising merchant class in Baltimore, is that Ellen North Mole did not fit into that role at all. In fact, all of the people he painted pretty much were of that merchant class, with the exception, I would say, of Ellen North. And so it's interesting that he would choose to paint her, or that she would choose to sit for him, as she was used to sitting for many of these really highly renowned artists. And what did that mean for her, basically? And so maybe it does go back to the idea that there was a relationship with John Mole that would have allowed that closeness. But also, so in painting it, how does he compare with other artists in the period, in other American cities, would you say? Stylistically, also from that merchant class that he's painting? Who would be the others you would think in the American circles that are doing that at this time?
The others who would be doing that are artists named Frederick Kemmelmeyer, who was a German immigrant to the United States in the late 18th century. He was working in Baltimore. I would compare Johnson to the itinerant artists, some of them, as we like to call them, limners, who worked and moved kind of in a fluid manner in and out of the city. You also have somebody named Caleb Boyle, who worked in Baltimore. But on a more broad plane, these people depicted members primarily more of the middle classes. He also shared something in common, interestingly, with miniature artists working in the city, some of whom did not spend lots of time there, but were his direct competitors. Because miniatures were seen as mementos in the early 19th century, they were enormously popular, along with silhouettes and small-scale oval portraits. And as far as we know, Johnson was not a miniaturist, but he certainly had to compete for patronage from some of the same people for these works. So within the city of Baltimore, those would be his competitors. Of course, the Peales are too. However, with the Peales, they're painting generally more of the political elite. And then if you go to other cities in the US, you have people like Jacob Eichholz or Thomas Sully, who are working in Philadelphia, who do paint members of the upper middle class. Jacob Eichholz also working in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, before he goes to Philadelphia. And in New York, you have an artist who worked for some time in Baltimore, but again, usually painting people of a higher social status, John Wesley Jarvis. That gets into a very interesting, another conversation about, you had mentioned before, Eleanor Mole. Well, one of the most prominent people whom Johnson paints, and I believe we have a slide of him, is Bishop John Carroll. And John Carroll would fall into one of those cases where Johnson goes sort of up a notch in terms of society. But Bishop Carroll, first Catholic Archbishop of America, like Mrs. Mole, has his portrait commissioned by many artists, including, I believe, Gilbert Stuart, but also Rembrandt Peale. So that's a very intriguing question. Why is it that the bishop and also Mrs. Mole have such eclectic taste? And I think that speaks to the status that Johnson had attained by circa 1815, that he's become a known enough entity and artist that people want him to paint them. So it's really interesting to see him sort of making a foray into this. It also raises the questions, are there lost portraits or portraits that haven't surfaced of more prominent Baltimoreans beyond the merchant class? But of course, that's his client base, are people like we shared before there, Greenberry Wilson, the McCormicks, and the Burnett's, for example.
David, I'm curious, and we're pretty much about 5 minutes left of our time before we open it up to questions and answers, but compared to today, and our African-American studies of today, with a lot of what's going on socially and historically, how does Johnson play a role today? And that when we look at him, do we look at a man that, I guess he was defying, the period strictures, right? But how do we look back today at Johnson? Because even though he's been in the artistic eye for the last 70 years or so since J. Hall Pleasance first worked on him, how do we look at him today and what he did and interpret his work?
I would argue that he's still very much emerging in the scholarly consciousness, to say nothing of the popular consciousness. And I think shows like what Daniel and the folks in Washington County have pulled off, and with the assistance of the Maryland Center, will only help to make Johnston more visible and therefore more part of the narrative. So much about what we'll call them marginalized communities have had to sort of contend with in the historical circle is this notion of invisibility. And once visibility is at least recognized, then there's this idea of dealing with tokenism or sort of exceptionalism. As we stand now, with as little as we know about Johnston, but still having the ability to say much, there's every reason to believe that other examples of people like Johnston, perhaps not artists, but in other walks of life, will continue, I think, to undermine this idea that slavery and second-class citizenship, as it was affixed to African Americans generally, or women generally, or other people of color, was very much purposeful and not necessarily connected to any sort of genuine humanitarian sort of moorings, as they often are. This notion of noblesse oblige, sort of the more gifted, the more talented, the wealthier, helping those who can't help themselves. When we see people like Johnston very clearly trying to break the mold that was ascribed to him, and we haven't had a chance really to talk about it in this session, but we certainly deal with it in our catalog. Johnston as an interracial figure, and helping to challenge some of the notions that we thought were fixed about how Blacks and whites sort of intermingled and intermixed and negotiated spaces with one another. Johnston is a product, as you mentioned in your opening, Mark, of an enslaved woman and a free white man who, by all accounts, as it appears, were in what we would call a love-based sort of relationship. And that challenges the narrative on some level and helps form new questions. So I think as Johnston begins to emerge, and as people, perhaps not even in art, but in other walks, begin to emerge, it'll help us and inspire us to continually revisit this time period to help us better sort of understand, generically how we got here.
Well, David and Daniel, I think that we need to get back to Margot now, where we're going to answer some questions the public may have for us.
Hey, Mark. This is actually Martha. Margot
Martha.
had some serious technical difficulties, so apologies, everybody, but I'm going to jump in and ask some questions from our audience.
Great.
So one question that came through, this person says, I understand that we're not certain about the spelling of Mr. Joshua's last name. I noticed that Dr. Taft-Terry chooses to refer to him as Johnston. Is there any particular reason?
Sure. Okay. Yeah. Well, As Mark pointed out, I'm not an art historian per se. My PhD is in U.S. history from Howard University. And I only mention that to say that while historians are historians on some level, we do often approach things sort of methodologically in somewhat different ways. As I came to understand Johnson, and I came to order, if you will, chronologically, the ways in which the spelling of his name was presented, and without necessarily having the benefit of the longer art historiography in terms of how they came to realize what his name was and what the possibilities of the spelling were. To my read, the earliest spellings use the T, either his father, George Johnston, or in Joshua's first advertisement of his skills, he spells it with a T. So while I am not necessarily 100% certain that I am right and everyone who's been doing this work for decades before me is somehow wrong, I do think that the coincidence of developments between, say, the late 1880s and the early 1890s in terms of George Johnston emancipating his son conditionally and Joshua Johnston announcing himself as a portrait painter to the world, the T was there, and that's how I settled on spelling with the T.
Thank you. Another question from Stacy. This is a question about sitters and wondering if sitters, especially women, were quote unquote allowed to sit unaccompanied with Joshua Johnson while he worked, or if a chaperone was required. Another follow-up question with that is, how did he work, if we know that? Did he take a sketch and then he went back to his personal space to finish the portrait? Some musings that I wonder if anyone can shed some light on.
I'm not really sure about whether or not any of his sitters would have to be chaperoned. It could be a possibility, especially for a younger woman. I know that chaperones were required for younger women to go out in some instances back in that time. But specifically for the sitting of a portrait, I'm not sure. Maybe Mark or David, you have an idea about that one.
I don't know of anything that we know for a fact of how Johnson painted. We do know that there were some graphite. You know, I have heard recently of a portrait that was cleaned a little too rigorously, and they discovered that there was pencil. So it doesn't surprise me. Whether he did it there, whether they did it at his studio, we just don't know. He does include his address, though, in his ad. So did they come see him there? This is all just, we just speculate at this point. We don't know if he visited them at their homes or if they came to his studio. We just simply don't know.
Yeah, I would simply, just anecdotally, I think we can determine for ourselves the likelihood of arrangements when we're talking about, if not truly wealthy, certainly a wealthy enough and rising economic clientele. And since many of these people are arriving with children, the notion that it would be Johnson alone with these individuals, I'm a bit skeptical, if only for the fact that, I mean, even for example, let's change Johnston's race to white. Maybe a white woman is painting a wealthy white woman and her children. Would the wealthy white woman be in this room by herself, just with her children, if she had the means to have the help and the staff that we assume otherwise was attending her needs as in her parenting in other walks or other aspects of her life? So I don't necessarily know that it was racialized, but I think we wouldn't necessarily be wrong to suspect that the social mores governing not just men and women who weren't their wives, but across racial lines. I don't know that that's a fool's errand to assume that some of that would have been in play.
Thank you. A few more questions. Do we have a self-portrait of Johnson, or are we aware of one?
No and no.
No, we don't have one that survives. It's possible he did one, but we can't say for certain.
Here's a question from Eliza. What was, or what do we know about the sense of Black identity at that time? And is there a sensible distinction between the free community and the enslaved Black community? Was it common for slaves to be manumitted at this time?
Well, I think we want to be nuanced in answering. Context is important. Geographic context is as important as chronological sort of context. And my experience in reading and writing to some degree about this part of the country in the early antebellum and particularly in the later antebellum time is that Baltimore was the part of the slaveholding South where the lines between enslaved and free Blacks were blurred. That because of experience, but more practically because family ties often held one kinship group on both sides perpetually. Let's not forget that just a few years after we believe Johnston died, as I said, perhaps our most famous 19th century Baltimorean, Frederick Douglass, escaped from slavery because not only did he was enslaved, but other Blacks who had free status, who had every reason to be protective and guarded of that free status, risked that free status to get him to freedom, be it what we would call a cab driver, the hacker Isaac Rolls, who willingly violated the laws to get him to his train, and certainly more importantly, Anna Murray, his would-be wife, who was already a free woman of color, who risked everything to help him to move. So we can talk about the differences of status, but I think in places like Baltimore and Richmond and Washington, and later in the antebellum period in Memphis, we don't want to overstate some line of demarcation between the free Black community and the enslaved Black community. It's probably more instructive to talk about the Black community navigating slave and free status, particularly in urban environments.
Thank you. I agree. I think that distinction is important. A few more great questions are coming through. Wondering if any other African-American painters of this period have come to light. Is there any correspondence between Johnson and other painters or artists? Do we know if he knew how to read and write?
The first part of that question, yes, there are other painters who were working in the period. Earlier in the presentation, we showed an image of by Reverend G.W. Hobbs of the African American minister Richard Allen. You also had Prince DeMont Barnes, whom we discussed earlier, working in colonial Massachusetts, and you have Scipio Moorhead also working in Massachusetts. And the interesting thing about Prince DeMont Barnes, he lives earlier. He dies in the year 1778, probably of smallpox, is that he also attained his freedom at the end of his life. And he actually traveled to England to study art with the famous British portraitist Robert H. Pine, who later emigrated to the United States or spent a period of time here, which I found to be very intriguing. So DeMont Barnes, he actually had formal training over in London. These really point out and bring up interesting questions, though we would have to compare and look carefully at the context of Massachusetts, being in the North, being quite different from Maryland, I think, in order to sort of compare and talk about Johnson. But around this time in the 1820s, you do have other artists who are emerging. And if Johnson died a little bit later, possibly in the 1830s, which some people will argue, you're going to see down in New Orleans the emergence of important painters such as, I believe his name is Jules Hudson, who emerges down there. New Orleans is going to see sort of an upswing in the activity of painting portraiture specifically.
Yeah, that's just off the top of my head, by the way, and I certainly would defer to Daniel's expertise, but a lot of the sources, for example, in my essay, I'm trying to track Johnston's movement across his lifetime through the city. And I don't know, for example, if there are papers related to Abner Coker, who was one of the people we believe Johnston painted, but they were all but neighbors later in Johnston's life, living in what we would now call Mount Vernon, at about the time I mentioned in the essay, at about the time the Washington Monument is going up. So there may be some correspondence. I'm not aware of any yet, but then there's also, as Daniel just pointed out, if he does live later, there may be evidence in other parts of the country The Baltimore city directories in the 1810s and into the 1820s are beginning to be more than populated by Haitian Americans and Baltimoreans of Haitian descent with discernibly French names and all sorts of monikers and other idioms that are used to identify themselves as part of this Haitian community. We suspect that Johnston was Catholic, and he certainly would have had access to that sort of Franco-American world. So as I suggested a few moments ago, we very well may be at the beginning of our understanding of who Johnston was, and being able to not only see him from his own perspective, but from the perspective of others, because there may be material in collections we simply have not uncovered just yet.
Thank you. We have time for 2 more questions. I'm going to ask a question from Dean. What do we know about the relationship, if any, between Johnston and the Peels? Dean also mentioned in the chat that the word genius is kind of referring to natural or untrained raw skill, and wondering if the Peels used that word in their museum advertisements or in the promoting of themselves. So kind of a 2-part question. Is there any relationship between Johnston and the Peels? And then again, going back to that term of genius.
I know that I can say that in 1987, it was very much pushed. The case was made that he had been a protege of the Peels, because a lot of his artistic, the appearance of some of his paintings echoed those, especially of Charles Peel Polk. And I know that Daniel can probably fill a little bit more on this. We have had no evidence whatsoever to show this, other than they were in the same communities, at the same time. And there is commonality, but a lot of those could just be sitters' poses, and kind of understood the whole concept of curtains and tassels and things like this. It was really, they made a very heavy case before we found, the manumission papers were actually discovered in the 90s here at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. Daniel, do you want to add to that from the Polk perspective?
Yeah, in the catalog and throughout the exhibition, I argue that he knew of the Peels' work, no doubt, because of how renowned they were in Baltimore. But I do not think that he trained under them. It's possible he might have received instruction from Charles Peel Polk, but then that gets into an issue of whether or not he would have been admitted to an academy, a drawing academy or drawing schools, of which there were several, and the Peels did operate one. There are other artists who also are some immigrant artists, but that gets into another issue of we don't know whether he would have had access to those kinds of establishments for that. So I believe that he taught himself primarily how to do his work and how to paint these portraits. And he would have had at his disposal engravings, oil portraits, if he did go into his patrons' homes, and illustrated books. And he was very thrifty and very frugal with his materials, his canvases, for example, in terms of how he prepared them and used them.
I would simply add, and deferring to Daniel's expertise in this way, just in terms of proximity, if Charles Peel Polk's studio / school was where we believe it was, according to the directories, it was quite literally 1 block south and 2 blocks east from where we knew Johnston lived for a long time. I'm not suggesting that proximity is definitive, but if he was self-taught, then we would have to think about the methodologies of teaching oneself and observation. Perhaps he frequented the shop. Perhaps he was like Douglas, befriending some of the students there, if not Peel Polk himself, and sort of, for want of a better description, stole his artistic education. I think it was Romare Bearden, however, in his famous book on African-American artists' history, who notes the fact that if we just look at Johnston's signature, which he affixed to a local petition for some sort of public works project in the 1790s, that signature is not the signature of somebody who had a rudimentary education in sort of literacy. It's not just legible, as Bearden puts it, it's practiced. So if he has access to literacy, if he has access to other sort of ways in which people educate and train themselves, just to my thinking, the idea that he would self-train, but would self-train with some access to professional examples like Peel Polk doesn't seem too far-fetched.
Well, thank you all so much. And again, apologies about the technical difficulties. It seems that even this much time into our virtual lives, they still pop up. So thank you for being flexible, and thanks for everyone who tuned in. There were a number of questions about where people could access the catalog and again, where they can see the exhibition. Daniel, I would ask if maybe you could remind folks how long the exhibition is on view and where they can purchase that.
Sure. The exhibition will be on view through January 23rd, 2022. You can obtain copies of the catalog in the shop at Washington County Museum of Fine Arts in Hagerstown, and I believe also in your shop at Maryland Center for History and Culture.
We do have them also for sale, yes.
Yes, and we also have an ebook version available that can be obtained from the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts if you phone the museum.
Excellent. Thank you all. Folks, please come to visit both institutions and find that catalog. We appreciate your time, and we'll see you for the next one.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much.